Very pleased to have Parag Khanna, whose title is Managing Director of Hybrid Reality, but in truth, Parag is a leading thinker and futurist about where the world is going next and what it means to us. He's a very sought-out speaker at many forums, from investment banks to academics to many people. And Parag will give us his take on digital and how identity and loyalty are migrating through technology. So without further ado, Parag Khanna, welcome.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So who has not heard this assertion made before? If Facebook were a country, it would be the equivalent of the second largest country in the world. Of course, you've all heard it, right? Raise your hands, yes? And how many of you agree with it? Makes sense logically, right? So, well, I don't see anyone raising their hands. That's excellent. I guess I can just leave now because I was just going to contradict this proposition. I think it's completely wrong, right, to think of Facebook and online communities as the equivalent of countries. It is intentionally not a country, right? The whole purpose of social media and these virtual worlds and communities we've created is to transcend the idea of national identity. And instead, it really is a gateway to multiple identities. And probably everyone in this room today sympathizes with the notion that we have and we carry these multiple identities today. And to understand the citizens and customers of today and the future, you have to decipher and disentangle these divergent, contradictory, and overlapping identities that we all have. Because which ones matter and which ones don't? We know that judging people by their nationality alone tells us very little anymore about who they are. Even the idea of passports are actually only about less than 200 years old. So today what I want to do is pretend as much as we can that we don't really have passports anymore. And what does that mean for how we think about people's loyalty and where it's going? So let's start with these women. Egyptian women wearing headscarves in Tahrir Square, Egypt. Are they for or against Hosni Mubarak, or Mohamed Morsi, or President Sisi? Or are they cheering at a Justin Bieber concert? What is it? Well, actually, Justin Bieber missed his Cairo date. I think he was in rehab or something like that. But had he shown up in Cairo, he might have realized that it's very hard to a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but it tells us very, very little about what people are thinking about who they actually are. Identities are so malleable today that governments around the world are in a complete crisis. Let me talk about what's happening right now in the United Kingdom and in Germany, for example. Two countries that have begun as of a couple of weeks ago to confiscate people's passports if they're suspected of wanting to travel to the Middle East to fight for the ISIS terrorist group. Meanwhile, however, if you are a cash-rich, full tuition-paying Indian or Chinese student who wants to go to Imperial or Oxford LSE, the red carpet is rolled out. So we're beginning to move towards a world where the notion of citizenship is not really based, of course, on your ethnic origin, but is something that is increasingly merit-based. Who does a government want to have in the country and who does it not want to have? And there's no two common policies about this. Governments are really fumbling around and trying to figure out who is loyal to their country anymore. And this is something that's going to accelerate in the future. So you get a better sense of just how rapidly this shift in identity is happening. Of course, if you look online, if you go back to Facebook and see the proliferation of people's international friendships and kinships, friends across borders, a 300% increase or more, this is obviously accelerating all the time, of people's international networks and friendships. And then you can look at how do they operationalize that. Look at how various charities and causes and campaigns are using social media to build online communities. So things like Just Giving, Do Something, Avaz, and so forth. All of them point to the rise of what some have called cosmopolitanism, right? You believe in this transcendence of nationality, and part of your core identity are the causes that you champion. And that's one way to understand what is motivating people's behavior today in the online world, and also to some extent in the real world. So let's look actually at how this translates, how this shift of loyalty away from just nationality is happening in the virtual world and the real world. In the virtual world, this increasing identity or affiliation with causes. And in the real world, it's migration. We have more migration today than ever before in history. There are 250 million people right now living outside of their country of origin, expats. Probably half the people in this room are expats, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we have about 1 out of every 15, 16 people in the world who doesn't live, and perhaps permanently won't live in the country that they were born in. And the shifts in migration flows that are happening today are so different from what we're used to. We're used to a world in which people from the south want to move to the north, and where the people from the east want to move to the west. Well, today we're seeing migration happening in all directions, and some absolutely fascinating research that I still can barely wrap my mind around was released by LinkedIn last month, where they talked about the top 5 countries from which LinkedIn members are moving, physically moving, versus the top 5 countries they're going to. And if you look at the countries that are the largest losers of their members, it's Western democracies, right? So where growth is slow, from the US to Spain. And the largest winners are what really, really strikes me, right? All emerging markets, Africa, Asia, Middle East. Absolutely incredible, this shift in migration flows as a result of economic demands and so forth. But there's a great irony in all of this. So the countries from which people are leaving, or at least where some talent is leaving for high growth emerging markets, are the northern and western democracies and so forth, moving to emerging markets. The places where the talent surplus is, where the growing numbers of trained graduates in engineering and sciences and business and so forth, are those emerging markets. But this is where passports rear their ugly head again, because it's much harder to travel around the world, work wherever you want, if you have a passport from Brazil, India, Mexico, and China, those countries that are suppliers of talent. So for billions, our political systems, in other words, our migration regimes, our laws, our border protection has not caught up with the demands of economics and the realities of education, in which there's a trained supply of people who want to work in places that need them, but can't quite go there. In other words, where we are from, the nationality we carry, the passport we carry, still, for billions of people, trumps who we are. Our education, our talent, what we want to do, the gaps that we can fill in the world. Which is why I believe that migration is migrating, or loyalty is migrating not just away from countries towards these causes, but also towards companies. Now, you're all very familiar with the idea that people want to work for companies that are identified as having a positive social and progressive purpose. But one of the most fundamental things that this large majority of people who are from emerging markets who have difficulty traveling around the world, what they look for is mobility and training. Those are the 2 things. So call it travel and training are two major priorities that people have. And so I believe what I find very often is that I sense this shift towards loyalty, going towards what I call the independent republic of the supply chain, which is another way of saying companies that will subsidize or underwrite or enable and empower your ability to move around the world. And again, this affects hundreds of millions of young people today from these talent-rich emerging markets. But at the bottom, I put some of the companies that are rated among the best to work for in the world based on Fortune magazine and other sources. And recently I was speaking at a business school in Europe, and a Russian girl made a comment. She said, thank God I work for this investment bank, because without it, I would have a very hard time being able to live in Europe such as I do, and then getting transferred to a position in the US and elsewhere in the world. She doesn't want to be identified as a Russian. She was much more proud of the company that she works for. And that's increasingly a phenomenon today. I can relate to this as someone who was an Indian citizen for a long time. Imagine my quantum leap in mobility as a result of becoming an American citizen. So what we should strive towards is a world in which, of course, you have mobility based on who you are rather than where you're from, and the passport that is attached to that. And maybe the lesson for some of you in your businesses is that you can tell more about a person and what their needs are based on who they work for, rather, of course, than where they're from. So mobility is definitely one thing that all people want, and what we find, in the macro picture of the world is that people are migrating first and foremost towards cities. You're probably all familiar with the data that says that there are 600 cities that represent 90% or more of the entire world economy. And even that number might be overstated because as the world urbanizes so quickly, these cities are actually fusing together into these mega corridors. I call them urban archipelagos. They're like worlds unto themselves. We're, of course, in one right now. Right? The Pearl River Delta region, just taken together, the 7 or 8 cities here combined, represent an economic unit that would itself be a member of the G20 group, right? So bye-bye Argentina, hello, sort of Pearl River Delta. And that's just one of the mega clusters that is here in China. And that's an emerging phenomenon all over the world, in fact. Now, when you survey your markets, should you be thinking about countries or should you be thinking about these cities as your principal markets? And then, if they are in fact worlds unto themselves, countries unto themselves, what are the issues that you need to understand about what kind of identity issues are taking place here? What kinds of social inequalities or access to services are different within these cities? Because they really are worlds unto themselves. And I think that's where you need to deep dive into these urban environments to understand the markets and of the future. Now, there is so much migration happening in the world today, particularly in these cities, that we have a new cast, if you will, of completely melting pot cities emerging in the world. Places where the foreign-born population may be larger, in fact, than the indigenous population. So a place like Dubai represents really quite an extreme. It is perhaps the headquarters of the global Generation Y melting pot. It's a place where, because so few people come from any one country, or not enough people come from one country for it to be a real foundation of identity, de facto what happens is you forge this sense of a transnational, international, global identity. And that's happening not just there, but in other cities around the world. Now, perhaps it's and the test of the success of these cities, obviously, their ability to remain stable, is going to be the extent to which they don't treat identity as something that is us versus them, the indigenous versus the foreign, but embrace this idea that we are, in fact, melting pots. Because here I've shown you, 5 cities, but there are 5 or 6 more that are going to enter this list that have 25, 30, 40% of their population being foreign-born in the years ahead as migration expands. So that brings us back actually to the world of the late 18th, early 19th century, in fact. A world in which there were cities that we called free zones, places that were economic hubs, trade, entrepôts, that were really open to all. So what's the archetype of that 19th century free zone? A real melting pot city open to all migrants. Anyone know? It's Hong Kong, right? Here we are. So this city really has been for centuries a place that defined what it is to be that hub, sort of open to all. And now other cities have become that as well. And how this adds on to the conversation is that we've talked about loyalty to causes, loyalty to companies, and loyalty to cities now, I would add to that as well. Which is why a good friend of mine, the scholar Daniel Bell, who teaches at Tsinghua University in Beijing, has coined the term civicism, which he calls the new nationalism. The pride that one has in one city, the loyalty to one city, supersedes that one has to one's country. I'm definitely a New Yorker first and an American second, right? Some of you could probably sympathize with that as well. And so we think of citizenship not as just our belonging to a nation, but our loyalty to that city in which we live. Which really, my final point brings me, right here to Hong Kong. Last week I was here and I spent a night walking amongst all the protesters, and I found that, of course, they were peaceful, they were unified, they were young, but it was incredibly diverse. It didn't matter where people were from, right? They were unified in a common vision for this city, their loyalty to this city above all else. And that is very much going to be the norm around the world as people identify with the city they live in, the diversity in that city, the fact that that city allows them to have and embraces them for having these multiple identities. So if you want to understand the young, mobile, networked, influencers of the future. All you have to do is just take a little time out and take a walk outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you much, Parag. Thank you very much. We maybe have time for one quick question. If there's one from the audience wants to put up your hand quickly, or if we have a tweet on the tweet wall. No tweet wall. Parag, looking forward, what does this mean for the economies, the world economies, as we go to this city model as opposed to the current model of identity and borders?
Well, you move towards a world of smaller and smaller units, right? When the United Nations was founded, it had 51 members. It has 200 today. So the world is actually getting smaller and smaller in terms of, and therefore no unit, whether it's a city or a province, whether it's Scotland or Catalonia or Hong Kong, can actually survive on its own. So every single small country, even if it's a big city, it has to be open. It has to be open to the world economy. It has to be open to trade and so forth. And I think that connectedness is something that cities have to take advantage of. So, for example, if you don't have a lot of, if you take Singapore as an example, Singapore has to have a lot of immigrants from ASEAN countries because it's a launch pad into those countries. So you want to have lots of people from Myanmar, from Thailand, from Indonesia there because they become the business ambassadors who know their own home country market the best, and they can move seamlessly back and forth between them and build your base. So the more cities sort of position themselves as the launch pads to larger markets, the more successful they'll be. I have a hopeful view that this means a more sort of peaceful world because the previous times in history where cities were the dominant players, they focused much more on their economic relationships with each other than on the control of territory, and I certainly hope
we all see that with the bilateral agreements between cities on the rise.
Completely, yeah. So places like Sao Paulo, for example, even though a country like Brazil has a very competent diplomatic establishment, they have formed their own trade relationships, their own trade networks. They have a diplomatic recognition from foreign governments like the United States and the United Kingdom. The same is true of Frankfurt, of Hamburg, of Dubai, of many Chinese cities as well. And so I really see these, those intercity networks forming. I call it diplomacity, so the diplomacy of cities.
Okay, excellent. If there are no more questions, raise hands quickly on the exciting presentation. Thank you very much,
Thank
Parag.
you.
Fantastic.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay.